The historic Molalla Log House, located in the heart of Hopkins Demonstration Forest in Clackamas County, is open to the public to explore its unusual craftsmanship. Where and when this interesting log house is built in Oregon's early history is unknown. Why people came to this area to build and what happened to them remains a mystery. But there are clues in the design and craftsmanship of this special log building that yield much information about its history. Over the years, the preservation team was steadfast in studying the building with the goal of staying as true as possible to the original design and workmanship of the builders who originally created it. The team rehabilitated original logs and hewed new Douglas fir logs with historic tools to replicate old logs.
My family's owned the property that it sat on since 1960, and we used it as a farm building. And my mom had talked to the elderly daughter of the family that owned it in 1892 when it was moved. So logs were carefully labeled, and they moved it and reassembled it by a group of farmers and local people.
I first learned about the Molalla Log House while conducting a historic inventory in Clackamas County in 1984. We came across the small, unique, highly crafted log building that was located about 4 miles south of Molalla in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains in Oregon. It really caught our eye because it was so finely crafted. The builders were clearly skilled and experienced in building a tightly fitting log building without the need for fillers in between the logs. They used their axes to hew the logs square, and then they carefully crafted half dovetail notching to hold them at the corners. As researchers, we set to work to try to discover the history of this building. From tax assessor records and from oral interviews, we learned that the building had been moved in 1892. But its history before that time, before it was moved, we had no idea. There were no documents that were written that explained who built it, where it was built, why it was built, or when it was built. Even though we did not know the history of the building before 1892, because of its fine craftsmanship, its design, its age, and its rarity, it was designated a Clackamas County Historic Landmark in 1991. After 40 years of being on the radar of researchers, we are still researching, and we still do not know the origins of this small log building. Perhaps it represents a chapter, an unknown chapter, in Oregon's early history.
In 2008, Pam asked me to look at this building called the Fox Barn. And the first thing I noticed is it wasn't a barn. And the second thing I noticed is that the roof was collapsed, and the logs were about half rotten, and others were pushed in the ground because it was built too close to the ground. And I told the Historical Society at that point that we weren't going to be able to save more than half of this building at best. The icebergs weren't able to keep it on this site. We couldn't fix it without taking it apart. The icebergs cared about it. Their son Rich was a Finnish carpenter and really wanted to work with it because he'd grown up with it. And so we became a team fixing this building.
Because the logs were so fragile, it took many people working together to take the building apart in the fall of 2008. Volunteers dismantled the log building and moved the pieces to storage. The preservation team of Pam Hayden, Greg Olson, and Rich Eisberg has spent over 14 years to study and then repair and reconstruct this historic log house on this new site in Hopkins Demonstration Forest. Grant funds were used to finance this work, It is open to the public to explore educational opportunities and learn about the building's extraordinary craftsmanship and history. The building is what historians call a primary resource, which means that it supplies facts to study to gain information. Although there is no documented written history explaining the origins of the building, the logs themselves tell their own story. The design and woodcraft of the Molalla Log House gives us much information about the original builders, including the tools they used, their skills and expertise in working with Douglas fir, and the date the logs were chopped down in the forest. The builders created a durable cultural and architectural imprint on the landscape where information can be gleaned about its history. The woodcraft of the Molalla Log House exhibits a foreign building tradition. The logs were hewn on all four sides with axes to fit tightly together without any spaces between them. The skill to make the joists for floors, the half dovetail notches, and the refined peeled pole rafters indicate the desire to build a well-designed structure built to last. As the logs were rehabilitated for construction, the architecture of the building was documented thoroughly. Much was learned about the builders by the choices they made in selecting the trees to use for building their well-planned design. The Molalla Log House is made of a softwood tree species called Douglas fir, which is common to Oregon and to the vast forests of the Pacific Northwest. It is ideally suited for crafting wood buildings because it was available in quantity and easy to hew and cut. Softwoods range in boreal forests across the North American continent and have been used for centuries to build log structures with woodcraft similar to the Molalla Log House.
The Molalla Log House is a very clever building. It's made by somebody who has made this same building over and over and over. They pick small trees that are easy to hew, remarkably easier than a tall log that's skinny. The way they cut in the windows, the way they attach the roof, the small rafters, every part of it shows a group that has done this before, found out by trial and error what works, what doesn't. They know about the splitting of the wood, that Douglas fir is as splitty as any wood known, and like other softwoods, not like hardwoods. They know to hew it when the sap's up because it's easier, isn't as hard on your bones. So the timing is very important. That they show up in May and June to do the hewing, and they let it sit. Now, the second crew comes, and it's probably years later, to put this building back together. And it's a different crew, and it's got different personalities. There's at least one head guy that knows how to do these fine dovetails. But there's other parts of the work that looks very amateurish, where they have 5 different adzes going at the same time, close together on a single piece of wood. We've looked at a lot of cultures who might have been able to do it. We haven't found which one it is for sure. What we do know, and what has been constant throughout the years, is that this is not an Oregon pioneer settlement building built between 1840 and 1860.
The builders chose young, small 60-year-old trees that grew straight. They square-hewed 72 logs to make the 4 walls of the log building. The size of the logs made it easier for the crew of builders to hew, lift, and stack the logs to create the walls of the house without the need for animals or machines. The house was designed and built for protection against the weather so that the logs would not rot from water moisture. The square hewn horizontal logs fit so tightly together that there were no gaps between the logs, with little filler needed from the inside required to keep out the weather. The corners of the house were held together by half dovetail notches, designed to drain rainwater away from the house. The Molalla Log House is a small, functional building with a compact and efficient design. It measures 18 feet by 25 feet and is 1.5 stories tall. The ground floor was one room, and the second floor loft provided a usable space with standing room in the middle. When each log was being assessed for rehabilitation, the preservation crew noted that axe marks on the logs told a story. These marks indicated that 2 groups of at least 5 people each were involved in the building. They came to the Molalla area prepared to build a permanent structure and brought tools with them, including adzes, slicks, broad axes, chisels, drills, drawing knives, and saws. They did not bring iron nails. Builders with different levels of skill in woodworking made different marks on the logs with their tools. The 2 separate crews worked on the building with a space of months to years in between. The first group felled the young trees and hewed the log square. Several months or even years later, another crew sculpted each log to fit tightly against the next without spaces in between. High mastery of woodworking is seen in the notches they created to secure the floor joists and roof rafters to the building, and in their expertise in making the half dovetail notches to hold the building's corners together. The house fits together by a series of notching techniques. The builders are exact in their measurements and use the standard English ruler. The floor joists were sculpted at the ends and fit securely into evenly spaced notches on the bottom logs called mudsills. The mudsills were mortised and pegged together. Wooden dowels or tree nails were used on the top logs in each corner of the house to keep the logs in place under pressure from the roof's weight. The builders of the Molalla Log House knew how to build a permanent and secure structure without the use of iron nails. The builders either did not have access to nails or they did not require nails because they had built log structures expertly without them. The roof rafters were not nailed to the building in the original design. Instead, notches were skillfully made in the top logs of the building to hold the hand-peeled rafter poles. These small Douglas fir poles were pounded into the notches on top of logs of the house, which securely fastened the roof to the building. The preservation crew was shocked to learn that this roof system worked. Another curious piece of evidence that the preservation crew discovered when examining the logs during the rehabilitation process was that windows had been planned for the original log house, but these windows were never made. Saw cuts were found on the building that had been cut when the logs were originally hewed. This would have allowed the builders to cut wide windows into the building after the log walls were stacked. By examining the location of the cuts, the symmetrical design of the entry wall of the house became evident. The design plan was for large windows on either side and one original door. 2 windows were planned but not cut in on the back side as well. Why this is the case is unknown, but they built a log structure with no openings, sealed against the elements except a single door. This means that for decades the building was dark inside, as we see it reconstructed today. Perhaps the crew that stacked the hewn logs had no other way to secure the structure except to leave it without window openings. During the reconstruction process, engineers required that holes be drilled through all of the logs of the house on 4 corners. Metal rods were threaded into these holes to stabilize the building should there be an earthquake. It was necessary for the preservation crew to manage the complicated shifting of the logs by machine in order to line up drill holes for inserting the straight metal rods during the stacking process. These rods are not visible and do not detract from the integrity of the design and the woodcraft of the Molalla Log House. In its original construction, the log house rested on foundation rocks. This raised the building off the ground to keep the floorboards dry. The preservation crew found large rocks at Hopkins Demonstration Forest to use in the foundation work. During the reconstruction process, steel rods were drilled through the mud sills into large foundation rocks so that the mud sills could be bolted directly into concrete. This is required to meet today's earthquake safety standards. New floorboards, made from a 150-year-old Douglas fir tree, were milled to the thickness of those used in the original log house. The width of the original floorboards is unknown, but made like those described in the diaries of fur traders at Fort Astoria in 1811. 2 new floors were made during the reconstruction process. One of the goals of the preservation team was to show how the building would have been constructed when it was originally built, without the use of machinery and equipment used today. Working together, the volunteers in 2008 carefully dismantled the logs of the building by hand. During the reconstruction process in the summer of 2020, volunteers worked together to show how the logs were lifted and stacked with human muscle and technique to create the log walls. Because the hewn logs were a manageable size, it took only 6 people to lift and carry the longer 25-foot logs and 4 people to handle the 18-foot logs. The preservation crew replicated all the pole rafters except one, which was original. The team shaped the ends before pounding them into the notches. In order to allow public access into the building, it was again necessary to follow engineered specifications in the roof design for earthquake safety. This required reinforcing the small rafter poles with steel tubing, which were then fastened to the top logs of the house with metal bolts. The color of these steel poles blends in well with the wood. The shingled cedar roof covers the roof structure. This interesting rafter system, using both the original small peeled pole rafters, now reinforced by steel poles, can be seen from the interior. Much effort has been made to establish the cut date of the logs used to make the Molalla Log House. Just as the pattern in a fingerprint can identify a person, the annual growth rings of a tree can identify patterns in its environmental history. It is possible to calculate the date a log was cut down in the forest by comparing the widths of its annual growth rings to other trees where their age is known. This study is called dendrochronology, and it works well in many places in the world. It does not approximate the age. It is either a specific year or it isn't. There are problems associated with dating the logs that make up the Molalla Log House. First of all, the logs are small and not large enough to have a century of data. Second, many of the trees in the Willamette Valley are not differentiated, which means that all of the rings are about the same because the weather is not harsh enough here to show clear delineation. Finally, only one environmental factor must dominate in limiting growth. In this area of the Willamette Valley, trees face more than one environmental factor as both significant rain and drought are experienced. The Molalla Log House has 2 joists that have the same distinct pattern. Many of the other logs are undifferentiated or not as distinct. The pattern is several years where the tree struggled with growth, separated by a little over a decade of undifferentiated growth from another several years of the same. If the logs were over 100 years of growth, there might have been more of a differentiation pattern to look at. However, the team decided to use these joists as samples to see if it was possible to find out when the trees were felled. The dendrochronology study for the Molalla Log House was done by picking large trees that were at least 200 years old and where the fell date was known. All the samples were done with trees that were dying because they were at the end of their life, and such trees may not have consistent growth when they are struggling in the last years, at least enough for foresters to notice. The samples taken from the Mount Hood National Forest were cut because they were hazard trees. The Yoder tree was taken before the wood deteriorated. 2 of the samples matched the Molalla Log House pattern. 2 people examined the rings of the Mount Hood sample and returned a cut date of 1798 and 1799. The Yoder stump matched the 1799 date. Many more samples were examined which did not match the Molalla Log House pattern anywhere. After this work was done, the samples were logged into a computer where they were compared to all trees in the Pacific Northwest. And the date returned was 1883. This date didn't make sense to researchers for several reasons. By 1883, Americans had lived in the area for 40 years, and nails would have been used in any construction at that time. Additionally, witness testimony by a person who was present when the building was moved in 1892 said that it was already very old at that time. A 9-year-old building would not be considered very old, although a bunch of logs lying in the forest might be said to be old, but they would not be marked for reassembly. After the building was moved, one original log was partially replaced with a circle sawn piece. This suggests that the wood had already deteriorated by that time. An abandoned small window was filled in with logs from the opposite side. Lastly, the replacement of most of the front wall all make the date 1883 unlikely.
After we took the building down and put it in a barn to get it through the winter, the next move was to find storage for it in a place where we could work on it. And it was early in the project, after working on it all day and just sitting there staring at these logs, I noticed that the ends of the logs were sharp, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. And the winter wood was razor sharp, and then the summer wood, the spring wood, went back as much as 3/8 of an inch. It's at that point I realized I'd never seen it before, and I went back to the buildings I'd worked on. I looked at the Pioneer Mother's cabin. It's built in 1931. It hadn't done 1/8 of an inch. Then I looked at Stafford Will, which is 1868, and it hadn't got to 1/4. I realized that the rate of erosion in the Willamette Valley isn't 1/8 of an inch in 70 years. And this led me to the conclusion that the building was not just different, but it's historically significant because of a very early age. The problem with this whole idea of the erosion is there's no way to know. You don't know if something's planted in front of it. You don't know if a shed was in front of it. It gives you a general idea of where the research needed to go.
While Greg and Rich were studying and rehabilitating the logs, I was doing in-depth historical research to try to attempt to discover the origins of its beginnings, the where, who, why, and when it was built. We gleaned most of our information from the log building itself. It is the primary resource to study. It has given us much factual information about who the builders may have been. However, I could find no documents, journals, or written records that explain this unique log building in early Oregon history. Within the context of what was happening in the fur trade historically at this time in Canada, it's not hard to believe that Canadian fur trappers and traders came over the Rocky Mountains on old Indian trails and ventured into the Willamette Valley and the Molalla area, which were prime hunting grounds for beaver and for fur animals. If they did not document their stay. Did they leave a lone log building on the landscape as evidence that they were here?
My hope is that when people come out to visit Hopkins and they first lay their eyes on the Molalla Log House, they'll be amazed at the beautiful craftsmanship, and they want to learn more about the history of the people that built it.